Fragile? You call these fragile? Get out of here, old man, before you break something else. The postal worker's voice sliced through the hum of the small-town post office, sharp as a blade, dripping with disdain. The young clerk, barely out of his 20s, leaned over the counter, his name tag, Tyler, glinting under the fluorescent lights. His sneer was unmistakable, aimed directly at the stooped figure before him. The post office in Mill Creek, Virginia was a cramped, aging building, its walls lined with faded posters about priority mail and passport services. The air smelled of stale coffee and musty cardboard, the kind of place where time seemed to sag like the warped linoleum floor. Outside, the late summer heat pressed against the windows, while inside the air conditioner rattled like a dying engine. A line of customers, 5 or 6 deep, shuffled impatiently, their murmurs blending with the low buzz of a radio playing country hits. At the counter stood Ezekiel "Zeke" Thompson, 78 years old, a Vietnam War veteran with a chest full of medals he hadn't worn in decades. His hands, weathered and trembling slightly from age, clutched a small, carefully wrapped package. Inside were his Bronze Star and Purple Heart, medals he'd earned in the jungles of Da Nang, now meant for his grandson in California, a boy who'd begged to see them for a school project on heroism. Zeke's gray eyes widened at the clerk's words, the insult landing like a punch to the gut. His shoulders, still broad despite the years, stiffened as he processed the dismissal. The medals, wrapped in soft cloth and nestled in a sturdy box, weren't fragile. They were heavy with memory, each one a story of sacrifice, of nights spent in foxholes, of friends who never came home. He'd spent the morning polishing them, his fingers tracing the familiar edges, recalling the weight of a rifle, the sting of sweat, the screams of war. Now, standing in this post office, he'd come to do something kind, something meaningful for his grandson. And this kid, had the nerve to call his life's proudest moments fragile? "Son," Zeke said, his voice low but steady, the kind of calm that comes from surviving chaos, "these medals ain't fragile. They've been through worse than your mail sorter." He pushed the package forward, his hands steady now, defiance flickering in his eyes. The line behind him grew restless. A woman in a red sundress muttering about being late for work, a man in a trucker hat tapping his foot. Tyler, the clerk, didn't budge. He crossed his arms, his smirk widening, as if Zeke's presence was an inconvenience, a relic taking up space in his modern world. "Policy's policy, Grandpa," Tyler snapped, pointing to a sign about restricted items. "No fragile stuff without special packaging, and I ain't risking my job for you." "Next!" He waved Zeke off like he was shooing a stray dog, already turning to the next customer. The dismissal stung worse than the words. Zeke felt the eyes of the crowd on him, some curious, others annoyed, none sympathetic. His chest tightened, not from age but from the familiar ache of being overlooked, dismissed, a feeling he'd fought since returning home from Vietnam to a country that spat on his service. He stood frozen, the package still on the counter, his mind racing. He thought of his grandson, little Marcus, who'd called him last week, voice bright with excitement, asking about the medals, about what it meant to be brave. Zeke had promised to send them, to let the boy hold a piece of his history. Now, this moment, his attempt to share something sacred, was being crushed under the weight of a clerk's arrogance. His fingers brushed the edge of an old dog tag tucked in his pocket, a memento of his best friend Jimmy, who'd died in his arms in '68. The cold metal grounded him, a reminder of what he'd endured, what he'd overcome. "Excuse me," Zeke said louder now, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the woman in the red sundress pause. "I served this country. These medals are proof of it. You're telling me you can't mail them because they're fragile? You think I'm fragile too?" The words hung in the air, heavy as the humidity outside. Tyler faltered for a moment, his smirk slipping, but he doubled down, leaning closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look, vet or not, rules are rules. You want to argue? Take it up with someone who cares." He shoved the package back toward Zeke, the box sliding across the counter with a dull thud. The sound echoed in Zeke's ears, a small but piercing rejection. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mix of impatience and discomfort. A young woman in the back, her phone already out, started filming, her face a scent catching the light. An older man coughed and muttered, "Give it a rest, kid." But no one stepped forward. Zeke stood alone, his hands gripping the package, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and shame. Then the post office door swung open with a jangle, the bell above it clanging sharply. A man in a crisp postal uniform stepped inside, his presence commanding the room. The crowd parted as he strode toward the counter, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum. His badge read, "Postmaster General." Zeke's breath caught, his grip tightening on the dog tag in his pocket. Something was about to change. "We've only just begun this story, but trust me, it's about to get intense. Stick around to see what happens when Zeke faces even greater injustice, and how it all unfolds." The post office in Mill Creek, Virginia, felt like a pressure cooker ready to blow. The air was thick with tension, the rattle of the ancient air conditioner barely drowning out the restless murmurs of the crowd. Ezekiel Zeke Thompson, 78, stood at the counter, his weathered hands clutching the small package containing his bronze star and purple heart. The medals, meant for his grandson Marcus in California, had been dismissed as fragile by the smug postal clerk Tyler, whose sneer still lingered like a bad smell. Now a new figure had entered the scene, a man in a crisp postal uniform, his badge gleaming with the title Postmaster General. The crowd hushed, their eyes darting between Zeke, Tyler, and the newcomer, sensing a storm brewing. Zeke's heart thudded, his fingers brushing the dog tag in his pocket, a relic of his fallen friend Jimmy. He didn't know who this Postmaster General was, but the man's presence shifted the room's gravity. Tall, with a jaw set like granite, the Postmaster General, whose name tag read Raymond Holt, scanned the scene with eyes that missed nothing. His polished shoes clicked on the linoleum as he approached the counter, the jangle of the door's bell still echoing in the silence. Zeke straightened, his broad shoulders pulling back instinctively, the way he had in '68 when facing down a commanding officer. "What's the holdup here?" Holt's voice was calm but carried an edge, like a blade sheathed but ready to draw. Tyler, caught off guard, fumbled, his earlier bravado crumbling. Sir, just a customer issue. This guy's trying to mail some fragile stuff and policy says—" Holt raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. The gesture was sharp, final. Tyler's mouth snapped shut, his face flushing red. Holt turned to Zeke, his gaze softening but still piercing. "Sir, what's in the package?" His tone wasn't accusatory, it was a question that demanded truth. Zeke swallowed, his throat dry, the weight of the moment pressing down. "My medals," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Bronze Star, Purple Heart, for my grandson's school project. He wants to know what it means to serve." The words carried a quiet pride but also a plea, not for pity but for respect. Holt's eyes narrowed, flicking to the package, then back to Zeke. The crowd stirred, a woman in a red sundress clutching her purse tighter, a young man in the back still filming with his phone, the light catching his screen. "Medals," Holt repeated, his voice low, almost reverent. He turned to Tyler, his expression hardening. "And you refuse to mail them because they're fragile?" Tyler shifted, his sneakers squeaking on the floor. "It's policy, sir. Fragile items need special packaging, and I can't risk—" Holt's hand shot up again, silencing him. "Policy," Holt said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're quoting policy to a man who earned a Purple Heart?" The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath. The older man in the trucker hat muttered, "Damn right," his voice barely audible but heavy with approval. Zeke felt a spark of hope, but it was quickly doused. Tyler, sensing the tide turning, doubled down. "Look, sir, I'm just doing my job. This guy's holding up the line, and I've got a quota to meet." He gestured at the crowd as if they were his allies. "Right, folks. We all got places to be." The woman in the red sundress nodded hesitantly, but the young woman filming shook her head, her lips pursed. The room was splitting, factions forming in the heat of the moment. Holt's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Tyler, enough!" It was a middle-aged woman in a postal uniform, her name tag reading Supervisor Karen. She pushed through the crowd, her face a mix of exasperation and embarrassment. "I'm sorry, sir," she said to Holt, then glanced at Zeke. "We'll get this sorted." But her tone was clipped, more about saving face than fixing the problem. Zeke's stomach sank. This wasn't help, this was damage control. Karen turned to Zeke, her smile forced. "Sir, why don't you step aside and we'll figure out the packaging, okay?" Her words were polite, but her eyes screamed, "Move along." Zeke's grip on the package tightened, his knuckles whitening. Step aside? After everything he'd been through, jungles, gunfire, a country that turned its back on him, now he was being shooed like a nuisance. The dog tag in his pocket felt heavier, Jimmy's name etched in his mind. He thought of Marcus, waiting for those medals and the promise he'd made. "No," Zeke said, his voice louder now, cutting through the hum of the room. "I ain't stepping aside. These medals are going to my grandson, and I'm mailing them today." The crowd froze, the air crackling with his defiance. Karen blinked, caught off guard. Tyler snorted, muttering, "Old man's got a death wish." Holt's eyes flicked to Zeke, a glint of respect flashing in them, but he said nothing, watching, waiting. Karen's smile faltered, her patience fraying. "Sir, you're holding up the line. If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call security." The threat landed like a slap. Zeke's chest burned, not with fear but with rage. Security? For trying to mail his medals? He thought of the protests in '71, the batons, the tear gas, the way he'd been called a traitor for serving his country. This wasn't new. This was the same old fight, dressed up in a post office uniform. The young woman filming stepped forward, her phone still raised. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "He's a veteran. Show some respect." A few others nodded, their murmurs growing louder. The man in the trucker hat clapped, a single sharp sound that echoed. But Karen wasn't swayed. She pulled out her radio, her voice clipped. "Security, post office front now!" The crowd buzzed, some shaking their heads, others looking away, unwilling to take a side. Zeke's breath came faster, his mind racing. He saw Jimmy's face, bloodied and still, the last moments before he slipped away. He saw Marcus, his bright eyes full of questions about courage. He saw himself young and proud, pinning those medals on his chest. He wasn't fragile. Neither were his medals. He planted his feet, the package a shield in his hands, and stared Karen down. "Call whoever you want," he said, his voice a low growl. "I ain't moving." The radio crackled, security confirming they were on their way. Holt's face was unreadable, but his hand rested on the counter, fingers drumming lightly as if weighing his next move. The young woman's camera swept the room, catching every face, every reaction. The crowd was alive now, whispering, shifting, some outraged, others impatient. A child in the back tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking, "Why's that man so mad?" The mother shushed her, but her eyes stayed on Zeke, wide and uncertain. Then outside, a new sound cut through the chaos, a low, powerful rumble, like thunder rolling closer. Heads turned toward the windows, where shadows moved against the glass. The door's bell jangled again, but this time, it wasn't just one person stepping through. The room braced itself, the air electric with anticipation. We're on the edge of something big. The climax is coming, and it's going to flip everything upside down. You don't want to miss how Zeke takes a stand, and who shows up to turn the tide. The Mill Creek, Virginia post office was a powder keg, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and the weight of a standoff. Ezekiel Zeke Thompson, 78, stood defiant at the counter, his weathered hands gripping a package containing his Bronze Star and Purple Heart, medals meant for his grandson Marcus. The young clerk Tyler had dismissed them as fragile, sparking a confrontation that had spiraled into chaos. Supervisor Karen had called for security, while Postmaster General Raymond Holt watched with a steely gaze. The crowd, restless, divided, murmured, some filming, others whispering, as a young woman's voice rang out, demanding respect for the veteran. Outside, a low rumble grew louder, vibrating the windows, and the door's bell jangled as new figures stormed in, shifting the room's pulse. 3 men in postal uniforms burst through the door, their boots heavy on the linoleum. They weren't security. They were higher-ups, their badges marking them as regional directors. Behind them, a woman in a sharp blazer, her hair pulled back tightly, strode in with a tablet in hand. Her name tag read, Marissa Cole, Deputy Postmaster General. The crowd parted, their murmurs rising to a fever pitch. Zeke's heart pounded, his fingers tightening on the dog tag in his pocket etched with Jimmy's name. He didn't know what was happening, but the air crackled with change. Marissa's eyes swept the room, landing on Holt, then Zeke. "Raymond, what's going on here?" Her voice was crisp, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Holt stepped forward, his posture rigid, his words deliberate. "A veteran's trying to mail his medals. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. This clerk," he nodded at Tyler, "refused, called them fragile. Supervisor's escalating it to security." His tone was neutral, but the accusation hung heavy. Tyler paled, his smirk long gone, while Karen's radio crackled, security still en route. Marissa's gaze zeroed in on Zeke, her expression unreadable. "Sir," she said, addressing him directly, "is this true?" Zeke's throat tightened, the weight of every eye in the room pressing down. He thought of Marcus, waiting for those medals, and Jimmy, whose sacrifice lived in the dog tag's cold metal. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but raw. "I fought for this country. These medals ain't fragile. They're my legacy for my grandson. And this young man," he pointed at Tyler, "treated me like I'm nothing." The crowd erupted, voices overlapping. The young woman filming shouted, "He's a hero!" The man in the trucker hat clapped again, louder this time, joined by an older woman in a floral dress who muttered, "Shame on you, kid." But others, like the woman in the red sundress, looked away, uncomfortable, still clutching her purse. Karen stepped forward, her face flushed. "Ma'am, he's disrupting operations. Policy requires—" Marissa cut her off with a raised hand, her eyes never leaving Zeke. "Policy," Marissa repeated, her voice icy. "You're quoting policy to a man who earned a Purple Heart?" The words echoed Holt's earlier rebuke, and Tyler flinched, his shoulders hunching. Marissa turned to the crowd, her tablet glowing as she tapped the screen. "This man's story is already online," she said, holding up the device. "That video," she nodded at the young woman whose phone was still raised, "is streaming live. Thousands are watching. And they're not happy." The room froze, the weight of her words sinking in. Tyler's face drained of color, and Karen's radio fell silent, her hand trembling. The young woman's eyes widened, her camera steady, capturing every second. Outside, the rumble grew louder, cars pulling up, doors slamming, voices shouting. Zeke's breath caught as he glimpsed movement through the windows. A small crowd gathering, some holding signs, others waving phones. The video had spread and Mill Creek was waking up. Marissa turned back to Zeke, her voice softening. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry. This should never have happened." She stepped to the counter, taking the package gently from his hands. "Your medals will be mailed today, priority, no charge, and I'll deliver them myself." The crowd gasped, a ripple of awe spreading. Zeke blinked, his chest tight, not with anger now, but with something warmer, unfamiliar, hope. But the moment shattered as security arrived, two burly men pushing through the crowd. Karen pointed at Zeke, her voice shrill. "Take him out!" The older woman in the floral dress cried out. "No!" The man in the trucker hat stepped forward, blocking the guard's path. "You touch him, you're answering to me," he growled. The young woman filming shouted, "This is live! Everyone's watching!" The guards hesitated, their eyes darting to Marissa, who shook her head sharply. "Stand down!" Marissa ordered, her voice a whip crack. The guards backed off, the crowd cheering, a wave of defiance washing over the room. Tyler slumped against the counter, his bravado gone, while Karen's face twisted, caught between fear and fury. Holt stepped beside Marissa, his hand resting on Zeke's shoulder, a quiet gesture of solidarity. "You're not alone, sir," he said, his voice low but firm. Zeke's eyes stung, the dog tag in his pocket a lifeline. He thought of Jimmy, of Marcus, of the years he'd spent carrying the weight of war, only to be dismissed in his own hometown. But now the crowd's voices lifted him, their anger his armor. The older woman in the floral dress approached, her hands trembling as she handed him a folded photo from her purse. A young man in uniform, her son, lost in Desert Storm. "You're why he served," she whispered, tears in her eyes. Marissa raised the package, holding it like a sacred relic. "This isn't just about medals," she said, addressing the crowd, her voice carrying to the growing throng outside. "It's about respect. For our veterans, for our history." She turned to Tyler and Karen, her gaze unflinching. "You'll both be on administrative leave, pending review." Tyler's jaw dropped, and Karen's radio slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. The crowd roared, the sound shaking the walls. Outside, the gathering swelled, veterans, families, neighbors, their signs reading "Honor our heroes and respect Zeke." Marissa stepped to the door, package in hand, and raised it high, a symbol of victory. The cheers grew deafening, a catharsis that echoed through Mill Creek. Zeke followed, his step slow but sure, the dog tag warm against his palm. As he crossed the threshold, a young boy in the crowd, maybe Marcus's age, saluted him, eyes wide with awe. Zeke returned the salute, his hand steady, his heart full. The medals would reach Marcus, but this moment, this reckoning, was for Jimmy, for every veteran dismissed, for every wound unseen. He looked at Marissa, at Holt, at the crowd, and felt something shift inside him. Not peace, not yet, but pride, hard-won and unbreakable.